Good weekend and happy Sunday, everyone. Today, in history, in 1889, 134 years ago, we have the incorporation of the Pemberton Medicine Company. This was the company which took a particularly famous formula for a whopping $2,300. This formula was the formula for the anti-headache drink. This drink made from coca leaves and from cola nuts. This company also renamed itself later on into the Coca-Cola Company. So, as this drink is born in history, today we have our update in the realm of Mythic Plus. We have gone about 10 or so days since the last time we looked at how things were in Mythic Plus, so it's time to have another look to see how things have changed. Because of two big reasons. Big reason number one, we have gotten even more nerfs, even more changes to the dungeons, so we get to see what is evolving in those dungeons, if they're getting easier, if they're getting harder, if certain specs are changing how they perform in those dungeons. And then of course, reason number two, we have gotten balance tuning hotfixes in the last reset, particularly to specs like Affliction Warlock, Destruction Warlock, Devastation Evoker, Fire Mage, Frost Mage. So we might see some further changes in how they perform after a few days already. We are already halfway through this fortified week in Mythic Plus. So let's go and take a look how things have evolved since 10 or so days ago. We are starting as usual from the popularity of the specs in Mythic Plus. We are also, as usual by now, skipping the all key population, mostly because it isn't really changing by much. The numbers by now are far too big to see major swifts in numbers in just a few days from when we looked at the first time. That being said, there isn't really a major change when it comes to healers. The healer population has remained roughly the same. We still have a dominance of Restoration Druid followed by Preservation Evoker. This has not changed regardless of buffs or nerfs to either dungeons or specs. Also worth mentioning that when it comes to healers, is not that we have received any major changes to these specs. We have gotten buffs to Mistweaver. So, if anything, we could have looked if Mistweaver was changing, and technically, yes, Mistweaver has gone from 2.1% to 2.3% representation, so a whooping 10% increase. That's the only thing worth mentioning. Not really any worthwhile changes when it comes to healers. When it comes to tanks, we already mentioned the dominance, the worrying dominance, growing dominance of Protection Warrior. So at the very least, this week, Protection Warrior loses out almost 10% of its representation. We see that Protection Paladin is growing, we see that Blood Decay and Brewmaster Monk and even Vengeance Demon Hunter is growing. So a positive TLDR for this week of Mythic Plus is that most tanks are increasing and the main popular guy, Warrior, is decreasing, which is kind of what you want to see, right? Numbers now are still not that great. Protection Warrior is still the main tank, but at the very least now we have a bit more of a participation, in particular for Vengeance and for Protection Paladin, now being quite higher up than before. Now on to the melee DPS and their changes. So when it comes to melee DPS, this is the least changed role in terms of damage. We are going to be seeing more changes, more switches in the meta when it comes to range. The melee DPS part is almost untouched. We do still see the same level of popularity for most of the specs. After all, there weren't that many changes, that many significant balance tuning changes for melee DPS in the last hotfix, so nothing is really changing. Where we see more changes is when it comes to the ranged DPS, because we have seen some changes to Shadow Priest, we have seen some changes to Fire Mage, to Arcane Mage, to Destruction, to Affliction, to Devastation Evoker, so maybe things are changing there. We can see a significant change when it comes to both Mage and Warlock. As you can see, Arcane has lost out a little bit more and Frost Mage is being played a little bit more. Similarly, Destruction is being played much more than before and Demo is being played much less than before. This is going to be our biggest change of the week. when it comes to changes in play rate for specs. Demo slowly losing out to Destruction is going to be the title of the week. It's a long way for sure. Now Destruction is still played 1/3 of a Demonology Warlock, but I think that over time this is going to continue to rise for Destruction in Mythic Plus. This major change this week for Warlock can be better represented in here, in the score graph of Warcraft logs. This might be a little bit messy, but you can very clearly see the line that was at the absolute bottom being Destruction. Now, in the last week or so, you can see that line doing a full turn towards the top, and now basically jumping ahead half of the entire group of DPS specs. This is the one for all of the DPS specs, and this is the one just for the ranged DPS specs, and you can see the growth of Destruction Warlock. We can also see it by comparing the scores in Mythic Plus based on the level of the keys and the performance in the keys of the specs taken from Warcraft logs, once again in the 90th percentile of performance in there, and you can see that Destruction is going from the absolute worst spec to more or less the middle, which is likely bound to improve as we go deeper down in the weeks of Mythic Plus and more players, more top level players switch to Destruction. Their performance is bound to improve. Most of the other specs, in particular the specs towards the top, are not changing that much. We do have a significant change when it comes to the specs success chance in keys, because as we will see once we look at the dungeons, this week is quite the harder week compared to what we have seen previously. So the specs success chance is not like the breeze we saw last week, where even the worst of the specs was sitting at a comfortable 63% and the top ones was at 72%. This week is a bit worse. This week the best specs are in the 57% range and the worst ones are all the way down to a 44% chance. And once again we can see that Destruction Warlock continues to be the higher ones out of the Warlock specs, and Demolock plummets to the bottom of the specs this week. We do also have a surprising rise of Shadow Priest, but also of Fire Mage, both of them going very high towards the top this week. Feral Druid is also improving by quite a bit. Technically also Enhancement Shaman has improved by quite a bit compared to last week. Balanced Druid is still there at the top, Outlaw Rogue is still there at the top, Windwalker also is still there at the top. Talking about the specs, we have the popularity of the compositions in Mythic Plus. Finally, we are almost there to the extinction of Demonology Warlock, because we started week 1 and then week 2 and then week 3, and we saw less and less, fewer and fewer Demonology Warlocks being present. We saw more and more melees, we saw the popping up of Arcane Mage and also the popping up of Enhancement Shaman, and now this week there is only one Demonology Warlock left in the most popular of the specs. We still see only Protection Warrior, we still see just a sea of Protection Warrior in the most popular role for tanks. We still see the 3 Preservation Evokers and the rest being Restoration Druid when it comes to healers, and then a dominance of Marksmanship Hunter, Outlaw Rogue, Windwalker and Havoc Demon Hunter as your choices for DPS picks. The only other niche options, as you can see there, for both weeks were Enhancement and Arcane Mage. This week we have one new entry. The new entry is one Balanced Druid present in there instead of Demo. That's the main change for the week, besides the fact that Demonology Warlock is dying out as a species in the top picks of Mythic Plus groups. Now, finishing talking about the specs, we go back talking about the actual dungeons, because this is the situation this week. We now have the new entry of this Fortified, Grievous and Spiteful week, which is currently sitting at the second worst week of this expansion. Significantly worse than the last 2 Fortified weeks we had. Very interesting, because now we have way more item level, we have way more players with tier pieces, and also we have gone a couple of weeks, even through the last week of Tyrannical, we went through a couple of weeks with nerfs to dungeons. So, multiple nerfs making dungeons much easier for this Fortified week, and yet this week is not faring well at all when it comes to the completion chance of the dungeons. Here is your current situation of the completion chance. Last week we had a 96% of Burial Grounds at the top and a 51% of Azure Vault at the bottom. This week Burial Grounds is still chilling at 96%, but at the bottom we have a problem. Halls of Valor is at 31%, and even Azure Vault is at 34%, and Jade Serpent is at 40%, and Ruby Life Pools is at 40%. So we have pretty much half of the Mythic Plus pool back to like week 1 to week 2 levels of completion, below 40% chance to complete the key, which is very, very low for being almost 1 month, basically 1 month into the season, and a significant drop in chance to last week, the last tyrannical week we had. Made further worse by the fact, as mentioned, that multiple dungeons have just been nerfed, and yet their chance to be completed is lower than before. Like, for example, the significant nerfs given to Ruby Life Pools, for example, and yet Ruby Life Pools has lost like 25% chance to be completed compared to last week. So, after having looked at both of the situation of the specs and the situation of the dungeons, we can finish with our tier list of the week, with how things have been going so far. This is the situation when it comes to tanks so far, taking these stats from sub creation, taking all of the key runs from plus 17 all the way up to plus 25, and weighing the different specs in those keys. Surprisingly, Blood Death Knight, despite being the second most popular of the tanks, is actually below most of the other middle of the pack group of tanks so far in this week. No surprise, of course, at the position of Protection Warrior. When it comes to healers, also I would say no surprise at this general ranking, which feels like has been this type of ranking basically since the start of the season, so no real changes there. Somewhat same can be said for the melee tier list, although perhaps we could mention Feral Druid being a bit higher than before, a bit higher than expected, and perhaps Fury Warrior being 1 tier below expected. Also, I could say I didn't expect Frost Decay to be considered that low in this week of Mythic Plus. And then we finish with the tier list of the ranged DPS, which once again continue to not have any specs in the S tier, any specs comparable to the top specs of the melee role. Once again, as a reminder of the disparity between Mythic Plus melee specs and Mythic Plus ranged DPS specs, but we can see, as we mentioned before, the growth of Shadow Priest in their performance, as well as the growth of Destruction in their performance after being buffed in their weekly hotfixes. Now they are placing themselves in the top of the tiers for ranged DPS. So, waiting further changes given by the balance tuning of this week and eventually by the balance tuning of 10.0.5, this was all we had to see for this week of Mythic Plus. What is left is just to wait and see any further developments of the meta in Mythic Plus. We will of course be here to report on this roughly every week, but for now what is left to do is sit back and wait. For today, for this Sunday, for this weekend, I'm going to leave you to whatever you were doing, which I'm assuming, being a Sunday, is not much. Procrastinating, I think, is the term. We can start our goodbyes by thanking, as usual, all of my Patreon supporters for contributing and for helping the growth of this channel. That is very much appreciated. However, you can still support in other ways that don't include having to break your piggy bank. Liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself, are still perfectly fine ways to show your support for free. Other ways to support include following me on Twitter, which could be helpful, especially to figure out whenever I go live on my stream, and also whenever I have some communications to release to all of my viewers. That would be the fastest way to be aware of anything I might have to say. And lastly, of course, sometimes supposedly I should be going live on stream on Twitch, generally from 10 PM Central European Time, 1 PM Pacific, and 4 PM Eastern US time zones. So, with these announcements out of the way, it's time to leave each other. Thank you guys again for watching. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, today was a historic day indeed. I believe it was the first time in years that I woke up at 11 AM. Wow, waking up at morning time. I feel like I'm 65.